material possessions more important than our earthly souls. It was Jesus himself who said, "What shall it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul?" How can we then think that a little bit of neglecting here and a little bit of neglecting there in our spiritual lives will bring us any profit? It won't. It will only bring us loss. This was the very plight Israel found themselves in. They looked upon the nations and they decided that their way of worship, their way of customs, their way which they did things were better than what Yahweh had told them to do. They put their trust in the ruler of men rather than the living God. And when they asked Gideon to establish a monarchy, they rejected God as their king and put their trust in an earthly king. Now, we see Gideon's answer to this. And Gideon gives a wise answer. He says, "I will not rule over you. My son will not rule over you, but the Lord will rule over you." And he uses the covenant name Yahweh of God for the people of Israel. The word that we see here in your text is usually capitalized in all capital letters. Capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. And that signifies the name Yahweh. It was the personal covenant name that God made himself with the nation of Israel. And so in essence, what Gideon is saying is that you don't need me to rule over you. You need God to rule over you. It seemed at that moment that he recognized the covenant between the nation of Israel and God. And it seemed like just for a moment that he understood that God wanted a theocracy rather than an earthly monarchy. Unfortunately, Gideon's wise words are lost in the very next verse. He says, "Let me make a request of you." There's verse 24. "Every one of you give me the earrings from his spoil." And it seems like an odd request, but in that culture it wasn't odd at all for the leader of the army to gain a larger spoil than those men who had fought with him. And you have to remember, Gideon only had 300 men with him fighting. Okay, and they had slaughtered 100,000 more or men of the dead. So they had probably had quite a large spoil. And so Gideon's request actually seems very minute, considering the fact that he was the leader of these men and that he, as that leader, had a right to take most of the spoil for himself. And so we see that the men do what Gideon asks. Now we learn later on that Gideon makes an ephod out of it. We're going to discuss what the ephod was here in just a minute. But the fact is that Gideon was using it in order to gain kind of a stature for himself. And although the text doesn't directly say that, almost every commentator agrees at least two things about it, or at least one thing about it, that Gideon's courage and Gideon's faith had suddenly shifted to greed. For example, in the pulpit commentary, we read this about this passage. It says, "Again, human weakness breaks out in this great man, and we seem to see the effect of great prosperity in stirring up selfish desires in his heart." It was perhaps not without significance that mention was made in verse 21 of his taking the ornaments that were on the camels' necks in connection with the slaughter of the kings. Anyhow, we have now a second instance of a love of spoil. And Albert Barnes, the great Bible theologian and commentator, comments this on Barnes' note on the Bible about this. He says, in this desire for gold, Gideon falls to the level of ordinary men. And we may see in it the first decline of his glory, leading to a sad tarnishing of the luster of his bright name. The idolatrous honor paid to Gideon's ephod was probably a source of revenue to his house. So there are some commentators, and other commentators agree with Barnes, that somehow or another this ephod that Gideon made out of gold was some type of a source of income for him. Now, the ephod here was something that only the priest wore. Okay, so when Gideon shaped this, the people looked at it and they knew what it was. Now, obviously, I don't think it was an ephod to wear. Okay, it was a solid. I think it was more of a solid object, and there are other commentators that also agree with this. The weight of the earrings themselves was 1,700 shekels, and if you convert that into today's weight measures, it's about 45.5 pounds. And so that's not including the other gold from the camel. You know, it tells us that they took the gold from the camel's necks, and whether that was included in the ephod or not, I don't know. But either way, if it wasn't, the ephod would have been about 45.5 pounds. And so I don't think it was something that Gideon intended to wear for himself. A lot of commentators believe that Gideon did this in order to kind of set up a center of worship. Okay? And so in verses 27 through 33, through 35, I'm sorry, to end of the chapter, we have the nation's calamity. So he takes this gold and he fashions an ephod out of it. And as I stated, many commentators believe that Gideon intended to set up some place of worship for the people of Israel. But even if his intentions were good, even if they were good, he was still in direct violation of God's commands. Because it was God who was the one to declare where the people would worship. Deuteronomy chapter 12, verses 4 and 5, when Moses is giving his final address to the people of Israel and instructing them how they are to live in the land, Moses tells them this: "You shall not worship the Lord your God in that way, but you shall seek the place that the Lord your God will choose out of all your tribes to put his name and make his habitation there. There you shall go." So the fact that Gideon made this ephod, this priestly garment, and put it in his hometown, signified that he thought of himself, or at least viewed himself, as the mediator between the nation of Israel and God. Now, as I stated before, the ephod was something that only the priest wore, and especially the high priest. And the ephod was made, when you read in Exodus the description of the ephod, you get this idea that it wasn't just a piece of cloth cut and thrown over the head. It was something that was very ornamented, and it was something that was painstakingly made. It wasn't just a cheap piece of cloth. As a matter of fact, the priest, the high priest, would put the ephod over it, and then over that ephod he would put the breastplate, upon which there would be 12 precious stones, and on each stone the names of the tribes of Israel were on it. And that was to signify that the priest bore and mediated for those people, for the tribes of Israel. God took the priesthood very seriously. And for Gideon to just assume that he could set up a place of worship, and in essence, even though the text doesn't say, we can kind of conclude that that's what it was used for, considering that the people ran after that in order to worship it. All we need to do is we need to look in Scripture and see the examples that God gives us of those who blatantly use God's worship in a different way than what God intended. For example, in Leviticus 10, verses 1 and 2, we see the sons of Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, who were ordained on the very same day as their father to be priests. God had prescribed a particular way to offer incense with the censers in their hands. Yet we see in Leviticus chapter 10 what Nadab and Abihu did. It says, "Now Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, each took his censer and put fire in it, and laid incense on it, and offered unauthorized fire before the Lord." Now, most of your translations will probably have strange fire, which basically just means that it was not fire, or they didn't do it in the way that the Lord had commanded them to do. And listen to the result. Fire came out from before the Lord, and the Lord consumed them, and they died before the Lord. So Nadab and Abihu, even though they were priests ordained by God, when they became careless in their offering and their worship to God, God consumed them with His fire. And even in another example, in 2 Samuel chapter 6, verses 3 through 7, we see a man called Uzzah who had every good intention of preserving God's holiness. 2 Samuel chapter 6, verses 3 through 7, the ark has been captured by the Philistines, and David is recovering it, and he's bringing it back. Now, according to the prescribed way, in order for the ark to be carried, there had to be poles inserted into it, and it was to be carried by hand. Yet when David retrieves the ark from the Philistines, he puts it on a wagon. And the result is this. It says, they carried the ark of God on a new cart and brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. And Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, were driving the new cart with the ark of God, and Ahio went before the ark, and David and all the house of Israel were celebrating before the Lord with songs and lyres and harps and tambourines and castanets and cymbals. And when they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah put out his hand to the ark of God and took hold of it, for the oxen stumbled. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah, and God struck him down there because of his error. And he died there beside the ark of the God. Now think about that. Here you have a guy who's actually rejoicing in God. He is rejoicing and celebrating that God's presence, or the symbol of God's presence, is now back with His people. But yet, when he reaches up to keep this symbol of God's presence from falling off the ark, from falling off the wagon, God strikes him dead. Now imagine that. Here's a guy who wants to worship God, but yet he doesn't do it in the prescribed way. And God's anger, it says, was burned against him. Our culture is very, very desensitized to God's holiness. We have made holiness about what we do rather than about who God is. And because of that, we're seeing the fruit of that in our modern churches. We've become lax in a manner of respect towards God's holiness, and it is only God's patience and mercy that has kept Him from striking us down. Though Gideon's intentions may have been to lead the people towards revival, his actions actually led them farther into apostasy. In verse 27, we see the sum total of Gideon's actions. It says, all Israel whored after it there. The ephod that Gideon made. All Israel whored after it. And it became a snare to Gideon and to his family. And the word snare here is used in the sense of trapping. A snare, obviously, if you guys have hunted or whatever, you make snares or traps in order to cage an animal. Well, it's the same word here, but the intention is more of to entangle and to bring under control. And this is exactly what happened with Gideon and his family. This, even though Gideon's intentions may have been well-meaning, it ensnared his family. It trapped them and got control of him and his family. So what happened, what started out for Gideon as a man of faith, ended up as a man of apostasy. But what got Gideon there? What was it that he did that caused him to fall? I think there's one major factor to Gideon's demise. And that factor is this. I believe Gideon took upon himself a God-given role. And I think that role that he took actually came in two different forms. First, he attempted to take upon himself a kingly position. Gideon's words to the people when he approached them were most timely. The Lord will rule over you. And that rings true throughout the whole entire chapter. I mean, it's just something that continues to echo in your head. after you read it over and over.